Welcome back to the Infinite Jungle. On today's episode, I am going to be talking about the main takeaways of all core developers execution call number 206. This call, developers spent the entirety of this call debriefing the Holesky testnet failure. That's right. The Pectra upgrade on Holesky was an outright failure. It was one of the worst upgrades I've ever seen happen on an Ethereum public testnet. I don't think developers have ever outright broken a long-lived public testnet before. Developers may have deprecated testnets, public testnets of Ethereum in the past, but I don't recall upgrades breaking public Ethereum testnets, at least ones that have as much mind share, as much activity as the Holesky testnet. And it really is a shame because since the merge, Ethereum has only had two long-lived public Ethereum testnets, Holesky and Sepolia. Now it only has Sepolia for Ethereum, for public testing of Ethereum upgrades. And for the Sepolia testnet, developers have decided to continue to move on with the Sepolia upgrade. The Sepolia upgrade, Pectra will be activated on Sepolia a day after this podcast goes live on Wednesday, March 5th. My listeners should be listening to this episode on Tuesday. So the circumstances for how the Pectra activation is happening on Sepolia are not ideal. Ideally, developers could have celebrated a successful Holesky upgrade and then looked ahead to Sepolia. But here we are. Though the circumstances and the nature of this conversation is not happy, I will say it's pretty exciting. This has been one of the more exciting weeks in the so-called Ethereum jungle on this show. So I'm smiling because we have a lot to talk about, unlike last week where I didn't have that much to talk about. So all of my listeners, get out your popcorn, or maybe in theme with the show, like put on your explorer hats, because we are diving into the Holesky testnet failure on today's show. Before we get started with the show, as always, here is a quick show disclaimer. I need to remind you to please refer to the disclaimer linked in the podcast show notes, and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice, an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy Digital or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Let's debrief what happened on Holesky. On Monday, February 24th, as planned by developers, the Pectra upgrade was activated on Holesky. But within a few minutes, developers realized they had made a pretty big mistake. 3 out of the 5 execution layer client teams misconfigured the deposit contract address for the Pectra upgrade. And basically, there are system contracts in Pectra. System contracts are these very special smart contracts. They're protocol enforced kind of smart contracts. They add new features, new functionality into Ethereum. And one of these system contracts is the deposit contract. The deposit contract processes validator deposits. When validators stake their 32 ETH, they stake it on the execution layer through the deposit contract, the system contract, and that deposit is processed and the validator is activated, spun up on the consensus layer side. And the address, the deposit contract address, because every single smart contract is a type of account on Ethereum. Smart contracts are a type of account. You can have a user-controlled account or you can have a smart contract account. They all have addresses to identify where users should be interacting with the smart contract, or if users want to interact with an EOA, an externally owned account, they have addresses for externally owned account, and it all identifies where your deposit should be going. So that address apparently is different for all public testnets. It's different on Holesky, different on Sepolia, different on Ethereum mainnet. And when developers had launched the system contracts for Pectra in advance of the Holesky upgrade, 3 out of the 5 EL client teams misconfigured the deposit contract address for Holesky. So when the Pectra upgrade was activated on the Holesky testnet, there was a validator deposit transaction, a transaction trying to make a deposit to spin up a new validator on Ethereum, on the Holesky Ethereum on that testnet. That deposit contract was processed differently by the validators running the Reth and Aragon client. So the Reth and Aragon client teams correctly configured the validator deposit contract address, but the Geth, Nethermind, and Bezu client teams did not. When the transaction to deposit 32 ETH was created and submitted to the Holesky testnet, all of the validator nodes that were running Reth and Aragon started to build a different block than the Geth, Nethermind, and Bezu nodes, the validators that are running the Geth, Nethermind, or Bezu clients. So there was a massive chain split because of that one transaction. And because the majority of validators on the network were validating on top of a different block than the minority of validators that were running the Reth and Aragon client. And so once that chain split was identified and the Holesky testnet started to stop finalizing because it didn't have enough validator attestation, enough validators participating and attesting to the correct head of the chain, you have this split. Some validators are attesting to this version of Holesky. Other validators are attesting to another version of Holesky. You have this massive chain split, and developers basically tried and have been trying, are still trying to recover and to have the validators on the Geth, Nethermind, and Bezu fork start to attest and validate the correct version of Holesky. Basically, the Holesky that the Reth and Aragon nodes have been building on, that was, of course, the minority chain. According to the most recent ACDE call, developers said that only about 10% of validators were correctly building the Holesky blockchain. And so there was this massive effort to try and migrate 90% of validators to start validating the minority chain and basically recover the Holesky testnet to get finalization on that minority chain. But of course, it's very hard because one of the things that my listeners should know is that for the Ethereum chain, for even Ethereum testnets to finalize, because testnets are a replica of testing environments for the Ethereum main chain, it requires 66%, at minimum 66% of validators to be able to correctly produce blocks and attest. And when you have 90% of validators either inactive because they're attesting to the wrong version of the chain, or slashed because they proposed an incorrect block, it's very difficult to try and gain enough of a majority, enough votes from validators to finalize the correct version of Holesky. So that was kind of what happened and the state of affairs that developers were in when they started the ACDE call. They were trying to recover the minority chain when they started the ACDE call this week. They had mentioned that they were having about, I think, a 40% success rate in terms of block proposals, because slowly, as validators are being slashed on the minority chain and inactive validators are having the penalty, as in their stake weight is decreasing, then the weight of new validators that are joining that minority chain and existing validators that have been correctly validating that chain, like the Reth and Aragon nodes, their votes and their attestations get weightier. So block proposals are coming through, but the minority chain still did not have enough of a percentage of validators, the majority of validators on that chain, to finalize the network. So the state of affairs was that Holesky was still down and not finalizing. So developers had to come up with a game plan when they were on the ACDE call. And this is the game plan that developers have come up with. I will give an update on next week's Infinite Jungle episode on how this plan went, but here's the game plan. And this really was a game plan that I think was primarily suggested by Prism developer POTUS. So shout out to POTUS, just giving credit where credit is due. And he did convince, I think, most of the developers on the call about this game plan, because at the end of the call, when Tim, who moderates the ACDE calls, asked if there was any objections to it, nobody really objected. This is a plan, I'm going to caveat, that is not really a solution to the state of affairs of what has happened on Holesky, because number one, this plan is not a plan that developers could ever do on Ethereum mainnet if a similar event had happened on Ethereum mainnet. And number two, it's a very kind of moonshot plan. There's not a high likelihood that it'll work, but even if it does work, the Holesky testnet will still take at minimum 3 weeks to fully recover, which means that the Holesky testnet will not be available for testing Pectra. That possibility is closed. That door is shut. Holesky is down for the purposes of testing Pectra. So let's talk about what the game plan was. This game plan has 2 steps. The first is make sure that all of the validators that developers have corrected. So the Geth, Nethermind, Besu teams, they've released new updated client software with the correct deposit contract address on Holesky, and they're spinning up new validators. And trying to make it a test to the minority chain that the Reth and Aragon nodes have already been struggling to progress. So the idea is to first make sure that all validators are on the same chain as the Reth and Aragon nodes and correctly attesting and proposing blocks, and I think a couple of teams, I believe it was the Nethermind team, was saying that they now have 100,000 validators correctly attesting to the correct version of the Holesky chain. So the first step is just to make sure that all validators are correctly all new validators are running the updated software and correctly attesting to what is the correct version of the Holesky testnet. And that definitely is the one that the Reth and Aragon nodes have been trying to progress. The second step is to coordinate a massive slashing event to quickly boot off all of the bad validators that have been attesting to a different version of the Holesky chain that were running on the incorrect version of Geth software, Besu software, Nethermind software. And the idea is to coordinate a mass slashing event, because all of these validators that are kind of weighing the Holesky testnet down with their stake, they have these slashing protections where instead of proposing an incorrect block or making an incorrect attestation, the validator will simply stop proposing and stop attesting. And this triggers a long inactivity leak for that validator. The validator, rather than being slashed and forcefully exited out of the network, the validator will simply slowly leak some of its stake weight. Every single validator has staked 32 ETH onto the network. And fun fact, after the Pectra upgrade, the minimum will be 32 ETH of stake, but validators can have up to 2048 ETH staked. But basically, some of the slashing protections allow these validators to revert into an inactive mode and just slowly kind of leak penalties for not participating and not performing the duties of a validator. But this makes it very difficult for the minority chain to finalize, because it has all of these validators that are inactive. And again, the network needs 66 at a minimum, 66% of validators to be attesting, to be participating in the network. Because if they don't, then the network can't finalize. So the idea is to coordinate a turning off of slashing protections across all clients. This is difficult because there's a variety of different types of slashing protections that users can put on their validator. Different types of remote signers, Web3 signers were talked about on the ACDE call. And the idea is to coordinate to turn off all of those slashing protections at once, have a mass slashing exiting of a lot of validators in one go, and kind of kind of force the minority Holesky chain into a state of finalization. Because ideally, if the first step has been done well, then the remaining validators that have not been slashed, have not been forcefully exited, should at least, 66% of them should be able to finalize the correct head of the Holesky chain. And for finalization to happen, not only do you need 66% of validators correctly attesting, but you need 66% of validators correctly attesting for 2 epochs, 2 periods of time on the Ethereum chain. I believe it's like 6.4 minutes per epoch, I think is what it is. So the first epoch requires 66% finalization, and then a shuffling happens. The validators get shuffled into different committees, and then you need a second epoch, also justified, also has that 66%, and combined, that's when the network goes into a state of finalization. So you do need like a higher buffer than 66% because of the validator shuffling that happens. You want at least 75%, of validators correctly attesting to the head of the chain. So the idea is if the first step has gone right, then do this massive slashing event, kick out all of the bad validators, and propel the network into a state of finalization. And if you can do that, if developers can do that, then as new validators are hopping onto the network, there is a finalized checkpoint that has happened post Pectra activation on Holesky that is a lot easier for validators to be able to find other peers with that similar checkpoint. What's making matters even worse on Holesky right now is that there is no finalization on the minority chain, so it's very hard for validators to find peers on this minority chain. And so having a finalized checkpoint past the Pectra activation point would be very beneficial. However, of course, making sure that step 1 goes well and then coordinating this massive slashing event by disabling slashing protection across all validators, across all clients. For step 2, it's difficult. And developers are trying to do this in, I would say, about 24 hours. When I am recording this podcast, it's Friday on February the 28th, and developers are meeting at 1500 UTC today to coordinate this massive slashing event, which they decided on this game plan basically the day prior on Thursday, February the 27th. However, I will note about this plan, and because there was quite a bit of pushback on the call initially, developers were saying, it's not likely that we'll be able to do this. We'll be able to pull it off because it requires so much coordination. Who's to say we will be able to get 75% of validators correctly attesting to the same head of the Holesky chain? POTUS noted that even if developers fail to be able to finalize the minority chain, at least they'll have succeeded in booting off a bunch of validators, a bunch of bad validators from the minority Holesky chain. And that is ideal because instead of having this very slow inactivity leak where the stake weight of these bad validators get underweighted in a very slow fashion over time, developers can expedite the ejection of these bad validators more quickly. So, even if developers fail at this plan, they'll have made some type of improvement to the state of affairs on the Holesky testnet. Now, let's talk about some of those reasons why I said this isn't really this is a solution for potentially reviving the Holesky testnet, but it is not a solution in the sense that it really does not help developers in any other way other than, potentially reviving the testnet. Because number one, again, once the slashing happens, if finalization gets reached on Holesky in the matter of the next couple of days, it's still going to take 3 weeks, at minimum 3 weeks, 21 days from the finalization point for all of the bad validators to be cycled out of the network. And so the Holesky, there is no way, this is not a solution to restore Holesky for the purposes of testing Pectra. Developers will have to rely on Sepolia to test Pectra, and they're going to have to think up of other testing infrastructure in lieu of Holesky. Second, this solution is not a solution that could ever be done on mainnet because there's no way that the Ethereum community would stand for a massive slashing that penalizes 90% of validators on the network because of a mistake that client teams made in their own releases. That would be losing billions of dollars. Users would be losing collectively billions of dollars simply because they took developers at their word, downloaded a new release of their software, and now, they're getting slashed. So this is not a solution that developers could ever replicate on mainnet. And so there really are not very many learnings from this process and from going through this solution, because developers can't replicate it on mainnet. However, there are other learnings. And the reason why developers are still going through the exercise of trying to recover Holesky, because in the process of trying to recover Holesky, developers are realizing, first of all, they really need some kind of way to standardize or better test the configuration files for Ethereum forks. The misconfiguration of the deposit contract address is a mistake that is avoidable, and of course will be avoided in future because of what has happened on the Holesky. But there's a way that developers could standardize the contract addresses or check that all system contract addresses across all clients have been inputted correctly. And so they were talking about some of those mitigation strategies on the call. They also talked about a way to enable socially agreed upon checkpoint syncs for the consensus layer clients. Again, developers, the whole point of this game plan from POTUS is to try and force finalization, a new checkpoint, finalization checkpoint. But what if developers had a way in which they could simply identify, okay, this is the right head of this is the right, block on which all consensus layer clients should build on top of, and that block or that epoch is not finalized, but is there a way to force consensus layer clients to still use it as the checkpoint, and help consensus layer clients come to consensus and start building collectively on the same chain, on the same version of the chain. So having something like a tool like this would be very helpful for developers in any case, if ever something like that happens again on a public testnet. Or if it happens, on Ethereum mainnet. And some of the other suggestions were very similar, because on Holesky there's been this very prolonged period of non-finalization of about a couple days. The activation went live, Pectra went live on Monday. I'm recording this on Friday, so at least 5 days of non-finalization. Are there tweaks to clients to be able to ensure that the software can withstand such long durations of non-finality? Developers are talking about other specific kind of tweaks, like disabling optimistic sync mode for validators, such that they can better sync to a minority chain or a chain that has not been finalized. These are all learnings that have happened because developers are trying to restore Holesky. And even though the game plan that they have right now is not something that could happen on mainnet and is not going to restore Holesky in time for Pectra, there are just other learnings that developers are gleaning from this process. So I want to talk about what are some of still the unanswered questions, because the one question of, is developers going to be able to restore Holesky? Will Holesky be revived? That's not an important question to answer, to be quite honest. Okay. The way that developers are reviving Holesky is very unique. It's not a process that could ever be replicated on mainnet, and it's not even going to Holesky is not going to be revived up in time for Pectra testing. So that leaves some other questions that we should answer that are more important. Not saying that I have the answers, but these are questions that are more important than the question of, will Holesky be revived? Number one, what does this mean for Pectra testing? There was a representative from the Lido team, Ethereum's largest staking pool, that shared some sentiments and concerns about what developers will do in lieu of Holesky. For them, Holesky is not just some DevNet that developers can spin up and break and spin up and break. Holesky is a quote unquote staging QA environment for the Lido team. There is learnings from activating Pectra on Holesky that is very difficult to have to the same extent on infrastructure, on testing infrastructure that is shorter lived. So because the Holesky testnet already has a version of Lido that has gone through the V2 upgrade, that has gone through Decoon. It has other applications and it has users. It has its own kind of built up state, blockchain state. When the Pectra upgrade goes live on Holesky, there are learnings from it that are very close to how and mimic very well what it'll look like when the Pectra upgrade goes live on Ethereum mainnet. But in lieu of Holesky, because now developers really only have in the Ethereum ecosystem, developers like Lido developers, they really only have Sepolia to be testing on. But Sepolia is a permission validator set. Sepolia does not offer the same kind of testing infrastructure as Holesky, which has an unpermissioned validator set. Anyone can be able to deposit 32 ETH and spin up a validator on Holesky. So what will developers do? Well, developers will likely set up a new DevNet, a new shorter-lived Pectra DevNet for the Ethereum ecosystem to be able to start testing the Pectra upgrade, in addition to Sepolia, which again is still going live on Wednesday. But how long is it going to take for developers to spin up that DevNet? Are there any other infrastructure that developers will set up? How does this impact the buffer period between the Sepolia testnet to Ethereum mainnet? Again, if my listeners recall, there was a move to put at least 30-day buffer period between the activation of the last public testnet upgrade, so Sepolia, to Ethereum mainnet. And so that put the Pectra upgrade on mainnet at the earliest in early April, 30 days from when Sepolia goes live. However, now that Holesky is no longer available for testing, does this mean that the Ethereum ecosystem and stakeholders may want a bit of a longer period to adequately test their infrastructure for Pectra? I do think that what has happened on Holesky calls and warrants for a little bit of a more delayed timeline for Pectra mainnet activation. I think it is possible that Pectra happens not in early April, but late April or even early May. I do think that in hindsight, developers, if they could have delayed the Sepolia testnet upgrade, they should have. Of course, they did not delay Sepolia for a number of reasons. Of course, I don't think there were some developers that were saying that what happened on Holesky shouldn't delay Pectra at all for any reason. However, there was also the concern that Sepolia, the upgrade on Sepolia, has already been pre-scheduled. When developers scheduled the Holesky upgrade, they actually bundled together all of the client releases for the Sepolia upgrade as well. So because they bundled it, that means that if they want to change any aspect in light of what happened on Holesky, the Besu client is getting updated, the Geth client is being updated, Nethermind updated, one of the consensus layer clients, Nodestar, is being updated. All of the users will have to that have already prepared for Holesky, and in doing so, they've already prepared for the Sepolia upgrade again because they've bundled the client releases. So nodes are ready for both the Holesky and the Sepolia upgrade. But since there's bugs from Holesky, these users have to upgrade again in time for the Sepolia upgrade. And if developers had said, let's move the Sepolia or cancel that upgrade altogether, all Sepolia node operators would have to update their software. They would have to update it to a new client release that actually removes the Pectra activation. So because of the hassle, I think, of trying to try and cancel the already scheduled upgrade on Sepolia, developers agreed, let's just, move forward with it. Because at this point, mixed messaging and miscommunication from protocol teams could result in a fork, an unplanned upgrade on Sepolia, because if developers tried to cancel it and the message was not adequately relayed to the entire ecosystem, then there could be nodes that still have the Sepolia upgrade configuration and they're still running the client release that contains the Sepolia activation. So they said, let's just move ahead with it, but let's communicate as soon as possible to the community that the Sepolia upgrade, that any node operators that have prepared for Sepolia using the Geth, Besu, Nethermind, or Lodestar clients, they need to update. They need to update in the next couple days, or else when Sepolia upgrade goes live, they're going to be on, again, there's going to be a chain split. They're going to be validating a wrong version of the Sepolia testnet. So what developers right now are doing, in addition to trying to recover Holesky, is simply get the word out that some Sepolia node operators, the majority of them, will have to upgrade their software once again. So in hindsight, I don't think that developers should have bundled the Sepolia and the Holesky releases, especially because developers were finding bugs in Pectra DevNet 6 up until the last minute. Up until Holesky went live, developers were still finding bugs on Pectra DevNet 6. So it was a high likelihood that developers, again, would find bugs in the Holesky testnet and be required to re-release client software for users. And I think giving users a bit more time to prepare for the Sepolia upgrade, making them two separate announcements, would have been more ideal. But of course, it would have delayed the Pectra mainnet timeline. And developers are very one of the main takeaways of the Pectra retrospective, which is the exercise that developers have been doing to prepare for the Fusaka upgrade. One of the main takeaways was that developers wanted to really make sure that they try and upgrade faster. That protocol developers, I personally think, also because of the persisting underperformance of ETH price in markets, the community division and kind of infighting that has been happening, it's been putting pressure on developers to upgrade Ethereum faster. And so that, I think, has truly impacted many decisions about how Pectra is being rolled out. One of those decisions was to bundle the Sepolia and Holesky releases. I don't think it should have been bundled. I think that a lot of this sentiment that developers, even though there were bugs on Pectra DevNet 6, should still move forward with the Holesky upgrade, saying that, testnets are for testing. I think I said that on my last episode as well, that testnets are not as critical as Ethereum mainnet, of course. But in light of what has happened on Holesky, I think it's clear that, sure, testnets are for testing, say, infrastructure, smart contract infrastructure, wallet infrastructure. But public testnets, in particular for Ethereum, are not for breaking. DevNets are for breaking. Public testnets are not for breaking. It takes a lot of resources, and there is a lot of value to public testnets for testing, that as much as possible, developers should try and not break public testnets. And of course, developers weren't trying to break Holesky, but I think they were being a little bit more liberal about some of these edge cases, some of these worst case scenarios. Well, even if Holesky goes down, it's still just a testnet. So let's move forward with the upgrade for Holesky as fast as possible. But lo and behold, the worst case scenario did happen. Holesky did break. And now, again, one of the questions is, how is this going to impact Pectra testing moving forward and the timeline for activation of Pectra on mainnet? And again, one of the tweets, I would say, Georgios, who leads the Reth client, the Reth execution layer client, he emphasized that what happened on Holesky should not delay Pectra or even planning for the next upgrade, Fusaka, at all. And that his perspective was that what happened on Holesky should not impact the speed at which developers ship upgrades and their desire to ship upgrades faster. However, I do think developers should use this opportunity to pause and to think about learnings from Holesky and potentially slow down just a tad to ensure maximum safety when it comes to upgrading Ethereum. I cannot stress this enough. Shipping Pectra safely is definitely more important than shipping Pectra by this arbitrary target of early April. I don't think that in the grand scheme of things, activating Pectra early April or late April or even early March is really going to make or break Ethereum. I think it can feel that way because of how much negative sentiment around ETH there is right now. But again, the priority, first and foremost, must be shipping the upgrade safely. And I will remind my listeners that there have been close calls, not just with this Holesky incident, but you'll recall just a couple of, I think it was last month in January, the Geth client had to implement a hotfix to address a bug that was in one of their mainnet, Ethereum mainnet releases. Last year, in I think December, developers very narrowly kind of warned the community against implementing a doubling of the block gas limit, because that is not, a change in the protocol that the consensus layer can actually support. One of the main code changes going into Pectra outside of the blob capacity increases maxEB. This is to avoid a scenario in which there is too many active validators on Ethereum, that the networking layer simply cannot handle that many active validators, maxEB. I'm talking about Ep.8251. That is essentially like a long-term bug fix for Ethereum. So the complexity of Ethereum's protocol, and just how many I's that need to be dotted, T's that need to be crossed for an upgrade to go well on Ethereum, it's clear there's a lot going on. Pectra is the largest upgrade by number of EIPs. I do think that developers should focus on creating adequate substitutes for testing infrastructure in lieu of Holesky for the entire ecosystem to adequately test Pectra. It's not just about the protocol being able to smoothly move forward with Pectra. It's making sure that all of the major applications, Lido, all of the decentralized exchanges, all of the major wallet providers can support the Pectra upgrade, and utilize its features well, when Pectra goes live, or at least shortly after Pectra goes live. And to do that, there needs to be the testing infrastructure. So I think developers should really take time to really think that through, and consider also potentially delaying a little bit maybe putting their foot off of the gas pedal a little bit in terms of speed, in terms of shipping upgrades faster, to make sure that they're not doing so at the expense of safety. So those are my 2 cents on takeaways from the Holesky incident, and some questions and thoughts to chew on as developers move forward with Pectra development and progress. I will have another update, of course, next week, talking about how the game plan for reviving Holesky went, and hopefully more color on what developers have decided in terms of testing substitutes for Pectra in lieu of Holesky, and hopefully a bit more clarity also about how this is all going to impact the Pectra mainnet timeline, which again, I think it is warranted to delay the Pectra mainnet timeline for a few weeks at least. However, we'll see, TBD on that, on the way developers move forward. Although I think that makes the most sense in light of what happened with Holesky. All right. That was the episode for today. I hope that it was insightful. I hope more so, actually, than being insightful. I just hope that my listeners have learned something new about Ethereum. As always, I thank you guys for tuning in every single week. I am signing off from the West Coast of the US this week. I'm signing off from LA, actually. I'll be back in the concrete jungle next week. I hope everybody has a great week in your explorations of the infinite jungle that is Ethereum. Stay safe out there.